Western Marxism, section Workerism and the Condemnation of Third Worldism. Disinterest in the colonial question can also be asserted and practiced in the name of a rigorous revolutionary theory and practice that, without letting itself be distracted by the countries of the periphery and by classes that, for the most part, are still linked to the pre-industrial world, instead concentrate on the capitalist metropoles and on the antagonist of class struggle par excellence, the working class. This is what happens in Italian operaismo, workerism, and in particular in the work of Mario Tronti. Quote, "Our workerism should be given credit for not falling into the trap of third worldism, of the countryside against the city, of the farmers' long marches. We were never Chinese." End quote. The founding text of Italian workerism made clear, in unequivocal terms in the title Workers and Capital, who the social subjects that interested Tronti were. We are in 1966. In Vietnam, the struggle for national liberation dared to challenge the mastodon-sized military apparatus of the United States, which the year before had played a not-to-be-forgotten role in the repression in Indonesia, in the massacre of hundreds of thousands of communists, during the defeat inflicted on the Third World militants of that country. In Latin America, the struggle against the Monroe Doctrine was fierce, and in the name of that doctrine, in 1961, the Kennedy administration attempted to invade and subjugate Cuba. In summary, the struggle between colonialism and anti-colonialism had exploded, and this contributed to feeding a crisis that, starting with installing Soviet missiles on the rebel island, pushed the world to the verge of a nuclear catastrophe. Without letting himself be distracted by all this, Tronti imagined Lenin in England, as the title of a central chapter of his book has it. Leaving behind a still scarcely developed Russia, the great revolutionary relocated himself to the center of the capitalist metropole, but not to analyze from within the British Empire, which was involved in one colonial war after another, and was ready to battle for world hegemony as, quote, the country that exploits the whole world, Engels, and because of which, according to Marx's denunciation, the very same working class, infected by the dominant ideology, considered and treated the Irish, inhabitants of a colony barbarically exploited and oppressed, as, quote, niggers. No, instead, in England, Lenin was exclusively concerned with the factories and working conditions. In other words, the great revolutionary is here read as the kind of trade unionist he bitterly criticized. Instead of England in the 19th and 20th centuries, let's try to imagine Lenin in the United States in the 1960s. He would have found in the most developed capitalist country and leader of imperial and colonial oppression around the world, in the country where, not a few times, the workers and their unions threatened, and not only with words, students, often of bourgeois origins, protesting the draft and the war in Vietnam. However, from the theoretical point of view of workerism, Lenin should have only concerned himself with the working class. Tronti did not give up his search for a pure state of class struggle, and in a recent essay, 4 decades after the publication of Workers and Capital, he felt he could finally state that, quote, 1969 was the true annus mirabilis. In 1969, the issue wasn't anti-authoritarianism, but anti-capitalism. Workers and capital found themselves physically face-to-face with one another. End quote. Here, he refers not to England or the United States, but to Italy. It is worth noting that, to find a class struggle in a pure state, Tronti was forced to have recourse to a country where the Communist Party exercised an enormous influence, thanks to the same political line of grand alliances that the theoretician of workerism did not in any way share. However, there is no doubt that the autumn of 1969 saw great developments in worker struggles. the workers were encouraged by and joined with a mass presence of students. Not a few of these were of bourgeois origin, and arrived at militant political activity starting precisely from the struggle against authoritarianism, identified and denounced first and foremost in the family and at school. Others underwent a process of political radicalization on the wave of protest against the barbaric war waged against Vietnam, and also from their enthusiasm for the effective resistance of an intrepid people against the gigantic military apparatus of their invaders. These were the years when, in Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East, the anti-colonial revolution, supported by the socialist countries, achieved brilliant success, and U.S. imperialism was in serious difficulty. It was a climate that made itself felt in Italy, where there was a communist party, stronger than ever, to which a large part of the militants and leaders that organized the great popular and workers' struggles belonged. With a more attentive look, the class struggle, which in the eyes of Tronti seemed to have finally achieved its pure form, reveals itself to have been nurtured from the start by the most diverse set of contradictions, including that of an anti-colonial revolution. The polemic against the possible contaminations of the class struggle assumed militant tones. We have already seen the mockery of the campaign, quote, of the countryside against the city, of the farmers' long marches. Here, the greatest anti-colonial revolution in history, which in China achieved success through the victory of the countryside, is the target of workerist sarcasm, along with one of its high points, which saw the revolutionaries led by the Communist Party march for thousands of kilometers, under fire from reactionaries, to fight the Japanese invasion that sought to enslave the Chinese people. This type of more or less workerist sarcasm is not new. Proudhon was likewise concerned with safeguarding the purity of the struggle between the poor and the rich, or between victims and beneficiaries of the theft that he considered property to be. He made fun of the struggles for national liberation of the Polish people oppressed by the Tsarist autocracy. Marx, who had founded the International Workingmen's Association in 1865, dubbed this kind of mockery, quote, moronic cynicism. Tronti did not seem to have reflected on this page of the history of the workers' movement. Instead, he doubles down on the question. Quote, the workers always had, they had to have, a mission to complete, and it was always saving something. It had to be. This mission, save the factory, save the country, save peace, save the people of the Third World from imperialist aggression. End of long quote. It is not explained here what, for example, the Chinese workers should have done while their country was being invaded. Continue to make wage demands without worrying about the enslavement that loomed over them and their fellow citizens? The binary reading of social conflict, which sees only one contradiction, between workers and capital, transforms this same contradiction into a prison marked by the most narrow-minded corporatism. And this corporatism distorts the reading of history. The 20th century is, quote, the age of worldwide civil war. In this frame, the world anti-colonial revolution has vanished, and it has vanished both as armed struggle and as economic struggle. While the countries that have achieved national independence sought to make that independence concrete and solid through the hard work of economic and technological development, workerism called for the, quote, workers' suppression of work. End of quote and end of section.